Well, welcome back to the second version of the podcast.
Edition. Second edition.
Second edition. Very good. We'll go with second edition of the podcast, The Choice. I'm John Geer, and
I'm Jon Meacham, editing John Geer.
Which is
full-time position,
and one that's welcomed by all. So we met about a month ago. Obviously, today we're actually taping, just so that you know, it's October 1st. The debate is going to be tonight between Governor Walz and Senator Vance. There'll be lots of discussion about that. We'll talk about the general state of the race. I think it's probably also worth just mentioning, giving a shout out, if you will, to the people of North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida, obviously, as well, and the devastation that Helene brought all of them. It's a tough moment for all those people, and there's lots of Vanderbilt faculty, family, friends, students, alums that have been affected as well, and so just wanted to start out with that.
Absolutely. Thinking about all of them, and hope all works out.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're basically 5 weeks out from the November election. How do you think things stand? Last time when we did the podcast, we kind of avoided that because we were just coming off the heels of the Democratic convention. We've now had a debate between the two presidential candidates. We've had lots of polling, lots of speeches, lots of rallies, lots of commentary. Obviously, 5 weeks out. What's your thoughts right now, Professor Meacham?
Well, I think we self-evidently live in a polarized country. Very few voters up for grabs. Feels to me as though President Biden's decision was the right one in July. Vice President Harris, I think, again, from the data, has a much stronger chance of winning the election, arguably, than he would have, moving down the barrel of the fall. I think the edge is slightly to the vice president, but it is a big, complicated, disputatious country. The debate, to me, the presidential debate, answered the central question, which was Vice President Harris up to the task? I think a fair-minded viewing of the debate, the answer is yes. The task of being president. Whether or not a sufficient number of people in the right states want her to do that is a whole other question. And I think having been predictably wrong so much in the past 8 years in American politics, I will not predict anything. I think that the advantage is slightly to her at this hour. But one of the issues about this era is that we live in a political climate in which truth does not always prevail, and facts are not as relevant as they should be. And for 8 years now, the 45th president has sown doubt about the legitimacy of any process that produced results he doesn't like. And there's an open question about whether there will be a peaceful transfer of power if, in fact, the 45th president comes up short in this campaign. And what fascinates me, for those who might think that's partisan, is you don't hear anybody saying it on the other side, right?
No, not at all. It's not part of the rhetoric.
If, Vice President Harris is going to challenge everything, you don't really hear that. And I think that's something we have to confront. Whether you're a Republican on policy or a Democrat on policy, what's most important to you? Is it a constitutional consensus? Or is it having someone who favors your policies in power for a particular 48 months? And I think that's a big part of the question, probably for voters who have already decided. I don't like, some people say that those who are undecided at this hour are not paying attention or are aren't as rational, perhaps, as other voters. I'm not sure that's true. I think you're talking about such a de minimis number of people, as you've argued in our class. Yeah, there are Biden would not be president, but for 43,000 votes.
Exactly, in three key states. Yep.
Okay, it's that's a home game at Yankee Stadium, and so who knows what will lead person X or person Y to decide. The other thing, there's the terrible hurricane we're dealing with in the American South. There's also a unfolding crisis in the Middle East, an escalation of conflict there. Hard to know how foreign policy ever plays out in American elections. But in an election where you're talking about a home game at Yankee Stadium, let's say 1,000 voters care about it.
Yeah, could matter. Yeah. It was 11,000 in Georgia, and a handful in Arizona as well, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Yeah, it's a nip and tuck race. There's no doubt that it's unsettled. It probably is a slight advantage to Harris, but that's relying on the polls, and the polls could have it wrong. The ground game seems to be in Harris's favor, and that's going to be really critical in this campaign, because it used to be 30 years ago that it was about persuading the undecideds to vote for your side, and hopefully you would get a whole bunch of them. So Ronald Reagan in 1980 was in a nip and tuck race with Jimmy Carter. They had a debate the last week of the campaign. Carter did not do well. Reagan addressed all the fears that he didn't have the temperament to be president, and basically undecideds, according to the data that I've seen, broke 75-25 towards the governor, then eventually obviously President Reagan. And that changed the game, and it went from a very close race to a landslide victory. That's not going to happen in this day and age unless the turnout machine of Harris is unbelievably strong and Trump does not. And all the evidences suggest that Trump does turn out his people, and so can Harris keep up with that. And so it's about mobilization. That's what the key thing is. And are the polls picking that up? And people are using different weighting schemes, and it makes me pretty nervous when they start to weight towards one side or the other, not intentionally, but it ends up having that effect. There's a good argument out there that Harris is actually doing better than the polls suggest. I don't necessarily know that that's the correct argument, but it's a credible one. But I think it speaks to uncertainty. And the other problem when we're relying on polls, because of this polarized era that you referred to just a few moments ago, is that the shifts that can happen in an election of 1 or 2 points, which are so important, are actually so small that polls are not precise enough to pick them up. And so that a 1 or 2 point move, which might be real, is also simply a product of the noise of a poll. And so you can't interpret it. And we see it in our class. I mean, when, students will come up to us afterwards, there was a CNN New York Times poll that showed Trump was in much better shape, and a bunch of students who were obviously Harris supporters all worried about that. Okay, fair, but don't, if you see a poll that says 48-47 for Harris, that'll make you feel better than if it was 48-47 for Trump, but it really shouldn't.
Right.
But we can't help ourselves because we're kind of seduced by the numbers of the polls, but the margins these days are so small that we really need to pay attention. I think we should pay attention to the behavior of the candidates as we approach. Where are they putting their time and their effort? Harris is really trying to do a full court press at this point in time. All 7 battleground states, especially North Carolina, trying to make a push on that. That was not going to be part of the Biden campaign. The Biden campaign was going to be the blue wall in the Midwest, and that was going to be it, and that would get you to the 270. So it's a new game in that front, and acknowledged by the Republicans. But does that mean that Harris wins? No. It means she might have a slight edge right now.
And you're right in terms of watching the candidates. Watching President Trump's the volume and frequency with which he tries to sow doubt about the legitimacy of the process will be a window into how worried he is. Because you don't sow doubt about the legitimacy of a process that's going to produce you as the winner.
That's right. And I think it'll be, I think that some of their internals probably aren't as strong as they would like them to be. I'm sure that's true, and that's leading to some of the rhetoric he's engaged in. And that's a sign that, he's trying to find that issue that makes a difference. And that's really one of the great fun things, but again, I'm a nerd, is that those campaigns that are successful find an issue and they stick with it. So if you take a look at what's gone on so far with the Harris campaign versus the Trump campaign, one of the things you can say is that the Harris campaign has found a theme and they've stuck with that theme. Now, there maybe it's the wrong theme, but they've stuck with it, talking about change, talking about the future, talking about economy. She has been hammering. She really hasn't changed her stump speech very much. Now, some in the journalistic world, the journalists would like to see something different to cover, but she's sticking with it, which tells me they think, at least, that it's winning. By contrast, Trump is still trying to find that theme that works. So over the weekend, he made references to Joe Biden becoming mentally disabled and then suggesting that Vice President Harris was born that way. That's kind of a new theme, which people have been upset about that theme or think it's below the belt. Fine, but what it tells me is that he's still looking for that theme. He's still looking for that thing that can provide a traction for him to get to sow doubts about Harris, because you're right, in the debate, she, like her or dislike her, she passed the test. Is she capable of being president? She looked pretty presidential.
Yeah. And so we're in October, so the fabled watching and waiting for October surprises, which have come and been hugely significant in the course of American politics. 1968, the evidence is pretty strong that Richard Nixon sent word to the North Vietnamese that they should not pursue peace in that critical last period. The indictment, of Caspar Weinberger, the Reagan Secretary of Defense, the last weekend of the 1992 campaign, which reminded everyone of Iran-Contra and hurt George Herbert Walker Bush in what was a fairly close race. And then perhaps the most fabled one, 2016, when the FBI Director James Comey reopened the email investigation of Secretary Clinton's. I remember being in the Atlanta airport on that Friday afternoon and seeing it and thinking that just moved a critical number of votes. Hard to know what that could be in this climate. But again, if we're talking about a home game at Yankee Stadium, it doesn't really matter.
That's right.
Any new stimuli in an electorate that's functionally an open synapse
Right.
Can be decisive. And so I think we're facing a huge test of citizenship here, and have for the era. But whether people continue to have an open mind about an election where the choice is so stark, no matter, and you can be on either side of this, but there's not a lot of ambiguity here, right? I think, I totally disagree with the moderate conservative attack on Vice President Harris as being too vague. I don't know Vice President Harris well. My sense from afar is she would be a good president, unlikely to fundamentally change the trajectory of the country.
Right.
For good or for ill. That's just an opinion. But I think that a lot of people who disagree with her on policy, but know they shouldn't vote for Donald Trump, are trying to find any reason they can to vote for Donald Trump.
Right.
And suddenly her failure to talk to the press. I was once a member of the press. That's much overrated.
Well,
Talking to the press.
Well, the press also talk about that issue a lot because they want the conversation.
Yeah,
they want the story. They have to feed the 24-hour beast to get stories. And so, yeah, it is an interesting dynamic to watch, that, because you could certainly, criticize Trump for the same thing. And the truth of the matter is that politicians have an incentive for being vague. They don't want to be super specific. None of them ever have. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 pledged bold, persistent experimentation. he basically said, we're going to try something. If it doesn't work, we're going to try something else. It was not a very specific campaign. So this is part and parcel of what campaigns normally are. And I see why people, they're surprised by Harris. Harris didn't go through a full vetting process. And so it's fair game to ask lots of questions, and there's not as much time. But, again, from a test point of view, and this isn't a partisan comment, but every chance she's had to where she could have made a mistake that would have hurt her, she's passed that test.
One of the things that fascinates me about the whole season is, and I wonder if the folks who have stumbled across this and can't get up to turn it off, who are listening, share this, is I think it's fascinating. Kamala Harris was, I think, unfairly maligned in a reflexive way for 3.5 years. And then, at least in the initial burst of the post-Biden campaign, she was kind of irrationally elevated and praised.
Yeah, that's fair.
Right?
It's absolutely fair.
It's sort of, there wasn't a lot of data for either view. And it's interesting, right? And whether, the sufficient number of voters and sufficient in the right states are going to choose to do this. I think she's much more of a known quantity than people give credit for, because I think we understand that she is and I say this with respect, not to diminish in any way, she is a conventional public figure. That's right. And conventions are there for a reason. They can be limiting and maybe keep us sometimes from rising in a commensurate way to our challenges. But by and large, for 2.5 centuries, we've had conventions as guardrails of democracy and also as the means by which we can make progress. And so I don't find her mysterious at all. What I continue to find somewhat mysterious is the durability of the Republican nominee's grip on people who wouldn't want him in their house, but want to give him the nuclear codes.
Yeah, it's the political science literature has always been searching for the issue voter, and there's a huge number of people who I've talked to who are going to vote for Trump, and they're voting for Trump on what they say is the economy and immigration. Those are the two issues. And they're issue voters in that sense, that they think that he'll do better on that. And that the whole discussion, which you've led in lots of your books and others, is the whole debate about character they've just put to the side, which may be the right thing to do. But we know that the presidency, you can take whatever positions you want on issues, but on any given day, you're going to be confronted with some god-awful problem. And those problems that come to your desk are not easy ones. I mean, right now, President Biden is dealing with difficult problems going on now in the Middle East, getting worse by the moment. And Ukraine, Russia is not going to get better. You have still problems in Asia, etc. There's just huge numbers, and you can't even anticipate what the problems are going to be for the next one. So it's, there's an interesting conversation to be had is what's the basis by which people should choose. There's been a longstanding belief they should choose about the issues, but that was always based on the idea that both candidates were out of that conventional mold.
Met a certain threshold test.
Right.
Yeah.
That,
that's true.
You've got, if Mitt Romney had won in 2012 over Obama, wouldn't have changed the character of the country in any serious
I don't think
serious way. And that's the change, and that's one of the things that needs to be talked about. And that gets us back to this role of evidence, which, one of the things about, we get to work at this great institution called Vanderbilt, is that there's a commitment from the very top all the way down to, not to ideology, but to evidence. And so, the position that, I certainly would support is that, make Liz Cheney president. This is not a partisan comment on my part. It's not that I would necessarily favor personally all of her policies, but she takes evidence seriously. She takes the Constitution seriously. She would have a set of policy debates that we're kind of familiar with. She's in that convention. And so that's what I worry about is people always think this is just about ideology, but it's really about a much more fundamental thing. And it'll be interesting to see, how the public plays it out. And at the end of the day, this is what, we're going to have to work out with our class on this, especially if Trump wins, is to get them to realize, wait a second, if you believe in a democracy, you believe in the public's judgment. And if the public decides that this is the person they want, you've got to support that in a way that, and you can complain about the Electoral College or whatever, but those are the rules of the game. We're not changing that. And so that's, and that's the hard part of American democracy, and especially for our students who haven't been through that many elections. They need to realize that this is, sometimes your team wins, sometimes your team loses. And we think about it in sports, and whether Vanderbilt wins their football game this weekend or not, we want them to win, but it doesn't have the stakes that's going on right now. And so that's part of, being part of a democracy, is realizing that, the other side, if they disagree with you and they have the votes, they get to call the shots.
Yeah, and I think there's a legitimate part of what's frustrating about this era is those of us who want to have the position, the kind of Madisonian position you just articulated, are actually forced into a more seemingly extreme position because of what President Trump and his supporters did after the 2020 election. And it's not that we of the broad center have become more partisan. It's that Trump and the Republicans have become less committed to democracy.
Right.
They've moved, we haven't. And yet we become part of the an argument, an ethos in which people can say, you know what, this is just another liberal professor saying X, Y, and Z. When in fact, I haven't moved, you did.
Right.
And it's a conundrum, and there's not a good answer to it. And I worry about this all the time. I mean, when I'm out in the wild and say things like, we must support those who support the Constitution, people clap. And I'm like, oh my God, why are you clapping? I mean, I shouldn't have to say it.
Yeah. That's the...
And so that's where we are. And so I would urge folks who are thinking about this to try to turn the temperature down a little bit. But turning the temperature down does not mean surrendering principle or surrendering an evidence-based view of the universe to a populist, largely illiberal movement. And look, if President Trump wins, President Trump wins. And my vote counts no more than the vote of the devoted MAGA person. The difference is I'm perfectly willing to have the MAGA person's vote counted, and they're a little less committed to having mine. That's
where the rubber meets the road, because we've got to be committed to evidence, and I think it's President Biden who says you just can't love your country when you win.
Yeah.
And that's part of what democracy is about, but calling the other side into question is a problem. So it's a tough election in that regard, but it's also, from our nerdy point of view, just an election that continues to give in a lot of ways. And I suspect
I would like it to give a little less. I would be happy with, a little Romney Obama, a little Dole Clinton. Yeah, I'd take it. Yeah, I would take it.
We hearken back to those days, and there were plenty of complaints about those two candidates at the time, for sure.
That's true.
So let's just end it. We have a couple more minutes before we have to wrap up. Any thoughts about the news media's culpability in all of this?
Lots of thoughts. I don't know how culpable it is. I think it goes back to what I stumbled around and tried to say, which is that it is a curiosity of this moment that someone who tries to be not bipartisan but supra-partisan appears partisan because one side has moved away from the constitutional consensus, thereby forcing the person who hasn't moved into looking as if that person is somehow farther away from the center. And I think the media, broadly put, we're all part of the media, let's say the press, sort of the traditional institutions that we kind of look to for at least the attempt to produce information and curate arguments for our public life, right? I have enormous sympathy for the people who are in my former craft, because when you say something now that is not partisan, it still appears partisan. And so the notion that, and because we have a binary system, I understand the conservative op-ed complex, industrial complex, that wants to say, okay, yeah, I get what you're saying about Trump, but what about? What about heritage? And it's called whataboutism. It's not a particularly convincing line of argument, but it's going to be with us forever, as Jesus said of the poor. I would just urge folks, and if they're part of the broader Vanderbilt community, they don't need to be urged to do this. But of all the elections that I know about and have lived through, this is the one that requires what I would think of as a supra-partisan consideration that you might have to vote for someone with whom you disagree on economics and immigration and choice, whatever else. But if you value having an arena in which we settle these questions, I think the choice is pretty clear. And it gives me no pleasure to make partisan comments that have partisan implications. It doesn't. But at the same time, we can also polite ourselves into oblivion if we don't say it. And I understand people disagree with me. I say, make your case, cast your vote, count it. Just make sure you allow me to make my case, cast my vote, and count it.
That's right. At the end of the day, we still have to be, in my view, about evidence and about rule of law, and to be otherwise is a serious problem. And we'll see where the public comes down. We'll have one more podcast before the actual formal voting later this month. So we will reconvene in a few weeks and see where the race stands.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of wisdom for us to share.
Oh yeah, there'll be lots of wisdom, and we'll see.
Or at least for me. I don't know about you.
Well, I'm just grateful to be absorbing all your wisdom, as I have been in the course of the class or whatever.
Absolutely.
Yes, I'm so beyond grateful.
I detect the sincerity of your
I know
gratitude.
you do.
I do. It's very sweet.
Yeah, we're very serious, but.
I got to go watch the baseball playoffs.
Yeah, that's
important.
That's important stuff. But in any case, thank you, and we'll be back in a few weeks.
Onward.